Dr. Rodriguez, let's go ahead and start with you.
Thanks, Celina. I'm so glad to be here with all y'all, and I'm really impressed with the amount of people that are on this call. It tells me about our commitment to actually the elimination of anti-Black racism in our campuses. I am in a situation now where we have found ourselves trying to do many, many, many things at once. We have a COVID-19 pandemic here. I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. So if y'all can mute, that'd be good.
Maija, can you mute yourself?
Now I'm hearing less. This is why I have earphones. Okay, so we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and as a family physician, it's my job to be on the front lines and take care of people who are dealing with the sequelae and the problems that have to do with this. And at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid essentially naked what the effect of systemic anti-Black racism is. We've known for many, many years that there are health inequities and that there are health disparities. And we have studied virtually every aspect of why they are caused. But the truth is, the one aspect we haven't dived into is the aspect of systemic racism. And it's pretty clear that systemic racism is a lot of, if not most of the problem when it comes to health disparity. At the same time, we are dealing with a national conversation that should have happened, oh gee whiz, should have been resolved 300 years ago, dealing with the murder of unarmed and can y'all hear me? Just nod. Okay, good. Dealing with the murder of unarmed members of our Black community, especially the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and it goes on and on. My point is this: we have societal unrest, and then we have to deal with what is in our circle of influence. And our circle of influence, for some of us, might be the university that we work in. It might be where our jobs are. It might be in our communities. But wherever it is, the one thing that I can assure you is that there is systemic anti-Black racism, period, in all of the systems. And this isn't an indictment. This isn't an accusation. This is a statement of fact. And the intentionality of it does not even matter. The only thing that matters is the existence of it. And we, as people of conscience, have a moral obligation to eliminate it. And we also have the obligation to eliminate it because it will make things better for everyone. So confronting this is going to be a very difficult and ongoing project for all of us who work in equity, diversity, and inclusion at the University of Utah. And we have made this the singular focus of our work, is dismantling anti-Black racism. And we have made it clear, and I hope to make it clear today, that when we're talking about racism and eliminating racism, that we are talking about it, doing it in an intersectional way. So it does not mean that because we're focusing on racism, we're going to forget about sexism. But it does mean that our focus on racism will also focus on sexism in the community that suffers the most from it, which is actually the community of Black and other women of color. So that's probably more than I should have said, so I'll let the other panelists introduce themselves.
That's great, Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you so much. Andrea, if you could go next. Are you able to unmute yourself? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I'll save some of my comments for the rest of the hour. I want to say that I'm humbled to be on a panel after watching the general session and watching those guests. That was amazing. And I don't know that I can live up to what we just saw. But there's three things that I would say. I'm here to represent human resources and what are we doing? And I would say that in addition to partnering with Marianne on several things, three of the things I'm ready to talk about today is training. But I'll say in the general session, it was noted, training's not enough. That's true. So there needs to be more, but we have a lot of resources to direct people to training. I would also say that we in human resources have really taken on the task of educating ourselves. And I can share some of the ways that we've been doing that. And the other thing, it's where a lot of our time is spent, is giving our departments across campus who employ staff resources and tools to do things better, to do new things for the recruitment, retention, promotion, and I also say engagement of people of color. And I want to give kudos to some colleges and departments who've reached out to us already. We've already had a lot of hiring supervisors and deans and people come to us and say, all right, we're going to post a job and we want to do it different this time. We want to advertise different and ask different interview questions. And some of you are on the call here. I see your names. I'm so glad to see friends and colleagues here. So I'm really impressed that in the last few weeks and months, while we're trying to market, you're all coming to us. And we love that. So I'll stay there so that Kristi can give her introductory remarks. But I'm really pleased to be in this particular group of people. This is very exciting for me. So thank you, Celina.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Kristi, are you available to come on?
Yes.
Excellent.
Everyone, good afternoon. I'm Kristi Ryujin, and as Celina mentioned, I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder. And while she read a very long bio, I apologize, that was very long. I wanted to share with you one of the most important elements is that I'm an alum of the University of Utah. I did both my undergrad and graduate degrees there, and I worked for the university for about 20 years. So it is so good to see folks, to be here, and I want to celebrate that the University of Utah has been doing this work for a very long time. And while we are in this challenging moment, a moment where we can take the opportunity to do more, where folks are really motivated, I also want to acknowledge all of those faculty, staff, and my peer students who were already in the work. Because sometimes when we get to these moments, people will turn to us, particularly those of us who are doing diversity work, to say, what are you doing? I've started to say back to folks who ask me that question, no, the better question is, what are you doing? So I want to thank the University of Utah for their incredible work experience and educational experience I had while I was there. And I just a little bit about what I bring to this conversation, which may be very little, is I tend to be very data driven. And one of the things that I think Vice President Villarreal asked me to talk about a bit, if the question comes up, is really about fundraising and corporate partnerships and how do you make this work in budget at a time when there's very little money. So again, data-driven sort of mindset, and then corporate relationships are part of what I think has helped me be able to move the needle at my institution.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristi. Go ahead, Kristi.
Sorry, I just want to share, I have a really bad cough, and so I may have to stop in the middle of something I'm saying, and I apologize already because it's already happened.
We've got a couple questions that are coming in via chat, but one question that I wanted to ask, I'll just take a little bit of liberty as a moderator, and I kind of want to open this up for discussion, and then we'll go right to your question. I believe it's Marcia. Can we program our way out of this? Can we program our way out of this problem? Which panelist wants to tackle that? Go ahead, Dr. Rodriguez.
So I love the verb that you use, program, because I think that when I ever think of the word program, I'm not thinking about programs as in the stuff that our offices do, but I'm thinking about computer programs. And my son one time told me, he said, computers don't do what you want them to do. They do what you tell them to do. And so the issue that we have with all of our programs and with all of our policies and their procedures is that they all work in the way that they were designed. So if it is that we are not seeing the compositional diversity that we would expect from our population and from our applicants, then we have to kind of look back and say, what's the system that we use to bring those people in? Is, you know, admissions, recruitment, and all those things. And then we go, well, wait a second. It's a program. So the system was programmed to do something, and it did exactly what it was programmed to do. So if we're not happy with our results, we have to change the system that produced the results. So when we're using the other definition of programs, which is, you know, I have a program that's run through my office that's for Health Sciences LEAP, for example. Excellent program, good results, right? However, programming is only a part of it. It is structural, systematic change. We got to rewrite the code for what we do, not necessarily produce more programs.
I love it. Thank you. Andrea or Kristi, did you want to tackle that? Or we can jump right into the chat.
I don't know that I'm qualified to tackle it, but I will say I admire what Dr. Rodriguez said, and some of the conversations that I and my team members have had with Marianne, and some of them are on the call now. Our recruitment manager, Danny Baum, is on the call. We're talking about how to do some of our things, whether it's systems or processes or programs differently. So we're still at the beginning of that, but I appreciate his comments, and I'll definitely think about that as I continue to have those discussions.
So I would say that programs can actually make a difference, but programs without goals or metrics, no. So what I mean by that is, if you design a program to address a particular problem and set metrics on what you're going to accomplish in those programs, and then hold yourselves and others accountable, then programs can be extremely helpful, right? But often I feel like universities sort of go, oh, we need a program because that will look good. That will make people believe we are taking the right steps. But programs without goals fail. And again, and you can't assess whether or not we're meeting student needs, particularly, or moving the needle on faculty diversity. So, and then there was a question in there asking about what metrics should the university use in assessing programs. We do this all the time. So right now, when it comes to students, undergraduate students, we use Colorado data. We look at the diversity of high school graduates in the state of Colorado. I often hear from people, there's just not enough students of color in Colorado, Kristi. And I say 40+% of all high school seniors graduating last year were of color. 30% of them were Latino. People are shocked when I say that. Our goal should be, as a university, to be really close to those numbers. If 41% of our state graduating from high school is a diverse student, then the university should look something like that. So that's a simple goal. We started a program called End the Gap, which was to be at 50% women in business. Some of you may know this already, but others may not. Business is horribly behind when it comes to gender. So when we set a goal around trying to work towards parity, then all of a sudden efforts begin to make sense, and programs that actually address the gaps can be created, and then holding those programs accountable for actually moving the needle.
That was a perfect segue. That was perfect segue into the questions in the chat. Janzel, did you want to ask your question? Are you able to unmute yourself? Possibly not, because I muted everyone.
Sure. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so I've been thinking about how, so I work at the College of Nursing, and I am in the advancement world. So I also work closely with the University of Utah Health Advancement and main campus advancement. So I kind of live in 3 departments, essentially, it feels like. And each individual department is having their own task forces and their own committees and their own conversations on it, and how can we do trainings, and what do we have to do here and there, and how do we move the needle. And like I said in my comment, you know, of course we have individual needs per department and how we need to move it, but could there be you know, a more centralized program put out by someone to say, here are some of the steps that already done that we can all across the board do. And that way we start to build community, like we're all working on the same goal. We're all learning the same types of things. We're all talking the same kind of dialogue, you know, all of those things. So what are your thoughts?
Andrea, let's start with you for that.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been at the university for a long time. And when Dr. Watkins really started using this idea of 1U, I was really pleased about it, because I have found in my many years at HR that your comment is relevant, that we maybe work with one college on something, but then another division or unit needed something a little bit different. And that's okay, but I like what you're saying. And we are trying to figure out how to have some things that have more consistency, or at least do better marketing communication about what's out there. Because I'll tell you, one thing I'm finding is we'll say, oh, well, there's this great training, you should have them come. So I'll just mention one, like the microaggression training through the Office of Inclusive Excellence. So I'll be talking to a department and they explain what's going on. I'm like, oh, why don't we just have them come to a training? Well, I didn't even know there was that training. I'm like, okay, we need to market better. Or as I mentioned earlier, Danny Baum and I, we get reached out about recruitment and we'll say, oh, well, you could do this or you could do this. And they'll say, I didn't even know you could do that. So I think 1U is important, but knowing that, like you imply, there are areas of campus that have their own mission, vision, values. And we need, as HR, we need to be knowledgeable about what the different areas of campus are doing, but still do what my boss, Jeff Herring, would say is provide central support for local decision-making. But there are some things we could do to market some of those things a little bit better. So that's definitely something I want to take some focus on and think about. So I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Dr. Rodriguez, what do you think?
So I think this is a great question. And thank you for doing the work you do over there in health sciences. That's actually the realm of our office, and we're delighted that you want to see a little bit more unity, because I think that's very important. When it comes right down to it, there are specific needs for specific parts of campus, but for when it comes to health sciences, we can actually make almost all of those needs kind of put together. One of the programs that we have is the Health Sciences LEAP program. And, you know, Kristi worked in that many years ago, and we're working on it today. And we know that that program produces results. It produces graduate students. It produces medical doctors and pharmacists and dentists and doctors of nursing practice. Okay, so the way that we can actually work together is actually having each of the colleges help us to scale it up. Our program only has 35 people a year. If we had 120 people a year, the demographics of each of our classes would look remarkably different. And, you know, part of that is going to be getting some institutional funding, but the real magic happens when we get our partners in development on board, because that will change how we look like. And it actually makes it so that we, as a health sciences campus, can better serve the patients that are in our state. You know, I love what Kristi said about how the demographics of Colorado are changing. Utah is changing in the same way. And it's this small Latinx minority that was here 20 years ago that has gotten to the point that there are more Latinx people in this state than there are rural people. And I want to say that again, because we have this focus on, we got to do stuff for the rural areas. We got to do stuff for the rural areas. I think that's important. But when we're talking about sheer numbers, it's more than 100,000 more the Latino population. So let's take a step back and, you know, look at those programs that exist and have more mutual investment from our development partners and from our academic partners in health sciences. And I think we can move forward quickly.
Kristi, let's toss this over to you then and see, how do we get the development partners on board? I think you have some expertise in this area.
Well, I don't want to say expertise. I have to fundraise for everything. And so working with our development officers is really critical. So Janzel, I think the question is really great about what can you do? And of course, I'm not at the U. So I don't, you all are working on this one university kind of idea, and I think it's beautiful. From our development officers' perspectives, this makes the work easier for them, especially with corporate partners. Being able to present a broad sort of menu of opportunities that organizations, corporate partners, donors can give to makes it easier for them. But what it takes, and I'll give you an example. So we did a proposal for Pepsi nationally, right? They wanted to give this big gift and they wanted to focus on diversity. At CU Boulder, there are only 2 units on campus that were capable of, at that time, to develop develop the materials necessary for the application. My program in the School of Business, the Office of Diversity Affairs, as well as the law school. We had data that we could contribute to the proposal. We could talk about the numbers of students we serve, the retention rates, the graduation rates. We had all of that data available to us. We could kind of lay out a variety of ways they could contribute. But that's the kind of thing that all of us should be doing together. And that makes development officers so happy, because then they can put it out there, bring resources in, and then the university can then give those resources out in an equitable manner that then supports the growth of our programs. But it takes all of us sort of working from this same idea of what metrics should we all be tracking and keeping. And then the other thing that's always interesting to me is, one, I don't let corporate partners dictate the programs that we do. I develop our programs based on the needs of our populations. But I always am thinking about, well, what is it that's next? What do we need to be doing? And so being able to have those things in mind and being able to push back, because sometimes your corporate partners, your donors will come to you and say, I want you to do this. Well, they're not higher ed folks. They're not in the trenches with us, and they don't necessarily have the understanding of what the university is doing or can do. So really being able to speak to these issues and come back to them would be so helpful. And again, from a development officer's perspective, I think this is the kind of experience they're dying for, because then they can go out and meet with folks and bring the large gifts in. Right now, so many of us are doing these nickel and dime kinds of gifts that when they're capable, when these organizations are capable of giving millions, they're giving small gifts to the university. And then they're waiting for us to have ourselves ready to be able to do these larger contributions.
Is it the metrics then? Is it gathering the metrics and having everyone gather the same metrics that would prepare the university in each department?
I don't want to suggest that we all have to do the same thing, because we have different needs amongst our different units, but some data should be consistent, right? We should know what our freshman class looks like, or, our in the medical school, your first years. You should know what your retention rates are. You should have a sense of your 4-year, 5-year, and 6-year graduation rates. In the business school, we count placement. Do our students get jobs? So there's these natural places where there's probably consistent data that we could all be measuring. But, to me, those are the things that I consistently think of when I'm speaking with other units across the campus. I ask them those same kinds of questions when they come and ask for assistance and thinking about what they can be doing differently. So I do think the University of Utah could establish those particular data in partnership with the advancement office or the development office, whatever you guys call them. And then that way you can basically take it out in one big proposal.
Nice, I like it. Any other questions for our panelists?
So the one thing that I would like to add is that when we're talking about metrics, I think we get stuck sometimes in this compositional diversity metric. How many of our students are rural? How many of our students are Latinx? How many of our students come from the queer community? Those are important metrics, but those are just beginning metrics. I really feel that when we're looking at programs to see if they're effective, we need to look at those goals, like Kristi said. At the end of the day, the Health Sciences LEAP program is extraordinarily effective in getting people bachelor's degrees on time with higher GPAs, all right? And it's effective in having underrepresented students participate in graduate programs. And I think that's really where we have to go when we're talking about student metrics, is what they do with graduate school. Because I think that bachelor's degree school is great. It's not enough for the change we need to see, because these pipelines are not just for service lines, they're also to actually increase the diversity of our staff, the diversity of our faculty. And so if we aren't helping people get as far and as much education as possible, our metrics are not the right ones.
Mauricio had a great question. Are you able to unmute yourself, Mauricio? And then Claire?
Yeah, I'm happy to ask the question with my voice. I was just really impressed with both Dr. Painter and Bakari and just everything they had to share with us. But I'm just wondering from our panelists, like, what were some key actions that they felt that they shared with us that we could start taking as administrators, as faculty, as students, I guess. And the reason why I asked is because I'm invigorated by what they said, and I want to do something. You know, like, what can I start doing Monday? Like, who do I email, or how can I change a behavior that can start moving the needle?
Andrea or Kristi, were you able to?
So I was able to only log in for a portion of the presentation, the first presentation, because we were logging in for this too. So I'm just going to say something that I heard from Mr. Sellers that I thought was really powerful. It came from the question that President Watkins asked. Like, it was really sort of a question that I want us to sort of unpack a bit, and he did too, around why, you know, sort of like, can we do this work without it being so tumultuous, I think is what her question was. And I kind of was like, oh, I wish that like that framing is probably not the right one, because as Mr. Bakar, or excuse me, as Mr. Sellers said, most change in this country has been brought about through social unrest and protest, and that's a good thing. And so, but when I talk to my students who are, you know, very involved in Black Lives Matter and very involved throughout the campus and trying to make changes generally, and have been for many years, what I'm trying to help them understand is you can come at administration as students with, you know, with all of the anger that is so rightfully so there. But one of the things we have to be able to do is organize our thoughts about what we really want. And so we need to have specificity in our requests. So when I think about what students can do, particularly, is that they themselves can help organize around what is it that we want to accomplish. And I say we because I always consider myself a student, but what is it we want, and what things can we identify as quick wins first, because quick wins are always popular with universities. Deeper and longer term kinds of change that we're looking for, and then the very big asks. But we have to be able to speak with specificity, because we have to be able to say what our goals are. And so one thing is, I guess, Mauricio, is that I would say, if you're a student, I don't know, but if you're working with students, helping students to figure out what it is they want is probably one of the most critical things, and being able to say those things in very clear ways. But for faculty and staff, I think for a lot of the staff who are in this work, I think that they're tired. And so one of the things I just want to do is acknowledge that work that they've been doing, and then to make sure that administration is supporting their work. So that's really important. And for faculty, depending on where you've been sitting, if this is new work to you, then being very involved and committed. And I think that one of the things that was said is about mentoring. I think mentoring is a great thing, but also if you're new to this work, maybe asking for mentorship would be a wonderful thing. And administrators, is that for me as an administrator, I need to get comfortable with the discomfort that we're in right now. Like, I need to be open to listening at all times, even on things that are making me defensive. And that's really hard. But I think that right now, there's a lot of opportunity if we organize our thoughts and give people real examples of the kinds of change we are seeking.
Andrea, did you want to comment on that as well? Were you able to attend the first session?
Yeah, the first 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I found powerful. So it made me think of both my place in the university and my place in my family life, was the story about his 15-year-old, 16-year-old daughter. And I had to have the talk with her about how to interact with police officers in public safety. And so in my personal life, I have a daughter who's 11. And when it gets time for her to drive, that makes me think maybe I need to say, hey, you have some privilege here. And let's think about what it might be for the people down the street or your neighbors or others, and really kind of maybe reframe the way I educate at home about things, but even also at the university. So I like the comments we've heard about when people ask you, how are you doing things? And I think I'm the one, on the other hand, who should be saying, well, how am I doing things? I've worked at the university for a long time. I've had a wonderful career here and a lot of privilege here. But when there's people who maybe are having things happen, maybe they easily got a promotion, but would they have easily got the promotion if they were, right, first generation college student, or ESL, or a person of color? And I think that that's definitely a theme that I heard, is thinking about how you ask questions and who you ask them to, and taking it outside of my own box, because I have my own reality and I need to be willing to, and like Kristi said, sometimes it takes me out of my comfort zone, and that's a good thing, is be able to talk about things from a different perspective. One of the questions on here, and I can't find anymore, also touched on other types of communities, LGBTQ, that type of thing. So I think about, with my daughter, often, and I have this experience in high school, right? Do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a boyfriend? And I try not to talk that way with my daughter. I say, someday, if you choose to date a boy or a girl, someday, if you choose to get married to a man or a woman, I know we're not here today to talk about that specifically, but just to build on what was said, I feel like I need to step out of my own bubble, so to speak, and listen more and ask more questions.
That was a great segue. Claire, did that answer your question, or do you want to ask more about your question? I thought that was really good as well. You able to unmute yourself, Claire?
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry to have my camera off at the moment. So yeah, just to put forward my question, and Dr. Rodriguez, I think you touched on it a little bit, but I very much appreciate centering, looking at solutions and metrics and evidence-driven types of practices, but I do wonder what other kind of strategies for those populations that tend to be invisible in those metrics we might talk about. So I was thinking in particular of LGBTQ students who I work with, but also undocumented students, thinking about what types of data we tend to keep at the university. And then also just thinking around the question, often in higher ed, I think we have this conversation around population parity and, inviting more folks to the table, but thinking about what kind of work we might need to do to prepare to serve people before we invite them into a space. I'm wondering if any of our panelists have, again, particular metrics or markers of success that you might point to, if we need to have these baseline things before, just use some examples that were talked about here, like before we go out and aggressively recruit Latinx students or aggressively try to increase number of women in business, or, any of those other kinds of conversations that we have. Are there specific benchmarks of success you might ask us to look at before that?
Panelists, who wants to answer
I have
that?
a question. Are you all using the Common App? Does anyone know if the Common App is being used?
We are, yes, we are.
You are. So Claire, do you know if you guys have elected to ask around LGBTQ identification?
So no, not currently. And so I'm the director of the LGBT Resource Center here. And I was just recently working with admissions to just this very cycle. We were able to add a question in the supplemental application for admission for undergrads only that will collect some specific information around LGBTQ plus identities. So this will be the first cycle that students will have the option, with the hopes that soon in PeopleSoft, there will be a self-service area that students can also update that information themselves throughout their time at the university. So all those things are just emerging right now.
To me, that's one of the very best things we can be doing. The Common App made it available for us to use that question. And I think it's just a few years ago, and many schools, including my own, have opted not to use it. I think there's fear politically that if we ask that question, that it will, that, our regents or our legislators will basically withhold funding. So it's been a political issue. But to me, to be able to have that data, and then there's also been, like I've heard people say, well, Kristi, we want to be able to protect LGBTQ students. And, what if someone got a hold of the data? And I've responded saying, I think that's the same argument that we've been making about race too, that was made prior to our ability to track race and ethnicity. And so data is supposed to be secure. And so I think we shouldn't use that as an argument for not doing it. I do understand the political challenges of asking that question. And Utah, having grown up there, in fact, I was just there this weekend, worried about getting COVID, but, I grew up there. So I understand very much the challenges of living in a very mixed kind of bag around the politics of the state. So it is hard, but I'm thrilled that you're going to be able to collect data and be able to know who's at the University of Utah, because to me, that's one of the first steps. But going back to the bigger question about like, what do we have to have built? I always tell people the toughest thing about doing diversity work is that we have to do things at the same time. You cannot just do recruitment without simultaneously developing, the climate that you need, the programs that you need to support students. And the same thing for faculty. You can recruit faculty and have the worst climate in the world, and they will stay for a season and be gone. And so to me, the work of diversity is that you have to simultaneously address what the needs are. So as an example, I'm going to use our End the Gap initiative. When we started really focusing on recruiting more women to business, we had to build out programs. So, we had all these case competitions to drive interest for women in business, showing how women contribute to the success of some of our major corporations. But what do they do when they get there? So a Women in Business Club was already organized, but we had to build that up more. We also had to address the lack of women in faculty at Leeds. Like that was horrible. It was so low and again, this is not unusual for business school. Business schools are predominantly male and predominantly white. And so thinking about how do we diversify our faculty, on top of that, what kind of support mechanisms do we have in place? So we have a women's leadership course now that takes students in, and they are supported throughout that first year. We have a program called BTech, which is a combination between our women business students and our engineering women students, the same populations that are struggling to develop relationships and support each other through. But all of it had to be done simultaneously and with very little money. So I agree that it's not one thing that we can do alone and just say recruitment, but for LGBTQ students, without data, we don't know. But in my old office, the Office of Diversity Affairs at Leeds, we served, and I felt this very much at Utah at the time, especially, is that for students of color coming to Utah, for LGBTQ students of color, LGBTQ students, first generation, low income students, in the beginning when I was there, the numbers were so low generally, we coalesced as, we came together because there was more power in that space. And so having spaces that serve a variety of student populations within your colleges and organizations can be very powerful. It also just creates allyship across varying sort of identities. And that's been instrumental too, because we inform each other's experiences, we inform each other's behaviors. And so it has actually contributed, I think, to climate.
Kurt had a great question regarding infrastructure as well, I believe, for Andrea. Kurt, are you still with us?
I am, yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to kind of do a little more background on the question. I think when we try to create more inclusive hiring practices and target our job postings in different offices to be more inclusive, we often kind of run afoul of HR regulations. And I think those regulations are very useful for creating a kind of standardized system, for making sure that all federal and state laws are followed, and it's useful in that way to kind of centralize those responsibilities. But when you try to be flexible and create kind of unique and more thoughtful postings, that centralization can be kind of hard and makes it hard to be flexible and move quickly. Are there any projects or programs or changes in the works to address that? And are there ways to kind of empower offices to, not break laws, but kind of create a more unique and kind of individualized job posting that addresses that issue?
Thank you for this question. I'd love to learn a little bit more about these experiences and whether they're with staff or faculty. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing that may not answer your question, but I'd love to follow up on it. In terms of recruitment, there is a lot of discussion happening about how to do that. But I want to quickly, I'm going to answer your question, but quickly in the chat, I saw Janzel make a comment that Dr. Good said our focus should be retention, 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 and then recruitment. And I love that comment. So I'm going to kind of circle that all together, Kurt, because he's spot on, and Janzel, you're spot on. But in terms of recruitment, we want to help departments create job posting language that gets to a broader audience and is more welcoming and inclusive, and not just post the generic University of Utah job description. And there's some things in there that are what they are, the essential functions, the minimum requirements. But we really want to start to word things in a way and craft things in a way that are more inclusive. And in fact, another thing we're looking at, and again, Danny's on the call here, thank you for backing me up in all this, is sometimes the way we word something in a posting is confusing. And if you go back and think about who worded it years and years ago, and I'll just be honest, maybe the way the minimum requirement or the questions on the application were worded were by, a middle-aged white man, and he was just doing it based on the books. Well, now I think it's time for us to look at that through different lenses and have other people review our job postings and review the way we write our minimum requirements and have more diverse eyes on it. We don't have a solution today, but we're definitely in discussions. We're partnering with Mary Ann's office on these discussions, and back to the 1U thing, we're hoping to partner with all of campus, including UU Health and maybe even hospital. I see there's some hospital representation on the call here. But all of that to say, yes, we're having discussions, but I agree with Janzel's comment that we can't just update and change the recruitment strategies without also looking at retention and engagement and onboarding and culture and those kinds of things. I think those two conversations have to go hand in hand. So I know that's kind of an overview answer. I'd love to talk more offline, but yes, we are starting those discussions.
Yeah.
One more thing, Andrea, sorry, I just want to suggest real quickly, is that we, I think one of the things too is our affirmative action statements are generic and they need to be reviewed as well. And there's some problematic, the use of the term qualified when talking about diversity, it seems so odd to me. And yet our affirmative action statements, I think, were born probably in the 70s and had little change to them. But many of our institutions are actually recrafting our affirmative action statements that go out in our hiring packets. And I think that too, it's a little thing, but like when I read those, I'm like, God, that's so much more progressive. It's like inviting me in a way that I'm much more interested in being there. And I think that sends messages to your applicants like, oh, they're getting serious now.
Yep, absolutely.
So the only thing that I would add to all that is that when we're looking at, things of hiring practices and HR, employment law and all that stuff, we're looking at essentially our job is to comply with the law. And I think that compliance with the law is like the elementary school diversity level that we're talking about. Compliance really should be the floor, and then we work on diversity above that. And this is how we move forward. And when we're talking, Dr. Lemke brought up a great point. What are some of the things that we can do before we start inviting people in, to make this a better place? And I think that it is so important. So just a little bit about me. I've been writing about equity, diversity, and inclusion for my entire career. That's my area of research, and it's specifically on faculty diversity in schools of medicine. So kind of a narrow niche, but I'll tell you, I have never once been asked before I got this position about what I was doing as a faculty member to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in my department. And I got evaluated every single year. When we're talking about change, that's where we start. You make it part of the evaluation. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is you tie it to compensation. I'm the chair of the Department of Internal Medicine. And I know that the internists throughout the country are 25% Asian American and 4% or 9% Latino. So I should have to answer to my boss why it is my department isn't more than that, or why it is that my department is more than that. Because the point is, sometimes we get lost in our comparisons. And I love the idea that we should be looking like the population that we serve, and that's important. But the other thing we have to look like is the applicant pool. And there's not a department in our health sciences that is as diverse as the applicant pool that applies for the faculty positions. And so we should think about how we're going to get to that point. And if we put in accountability metrics, that will force the change. If we tie the accountability to compensation, that'll make it happen like this.
Oh, this is a great conversation. Just when we get cooking, we have to have a final question. And I'm going to try to combine two questions from Lane Jaramillo and Jewel. So Lane says, what are some tangible ways we can move the needle at the university? Jewel asked, how do you feel like you can move the needle when politically it feels so polarized? So I kind of combined that to our final question, panelists. Who wants to start that? There you go. Take it away, Dr. Rodriguez.
I'll break my own rule and go first. I'll say that one of the things that makes things happen is actual unity. And unless we're all on board with the same mission, the way that systems of power work, they will pit one faction against another to make sure that those who have power keep power. And I'm not saying that that's on purpose or there's any bad guys involved. There's none, okay? But the point is this, it's unity. If we talk about things that made change happen in civil rights, which is before most of us were born, it wasn't that the Black population was incensed and protesting about it. Yes, they were, and they were doing it for decades before Rosa Parks was arrested. What made things change was that people who weren't from Rosa Parks' background actually got involved. So if we're talking about working and eliminating anti-Black racism, that's not the job of the Black population. That's the job of all of us. And if we all work on it together, we can actually make significant change quickly. But if we don't, we will have this conversation in 20 years and go, why is it that it hasn't changed?
I like that answer. And what I would add to it is continue to talk about it and be the one to speak up and ask questions. So I mentioned at the beginning that in HR, we're working on educating ourselves. And our leadership team went through a process of readings and videos and podcasts with our professional organization. And it was called the 21-Day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge, where we were learning all these things. And at the end of each week, it gave us a list of discussion questions and said, okay, now talk to your colleagues or talk about this at staff meeting. And I think really we need to do that and do it at every meeting and do it every week and do it when we meet with our customers. So I'm a member of Embedded HR, that was mentioned, which means every month I go out and I meet with my customers. I should be taking one of those questions or discussion bullets with me and saying, what about this? So I would say that we don't want to get to a point where we just think the status quo is okay because we're so busy and there's a pandemic. I think part of it is continuing to talk about it. And so I want to use these questions that were posed and put them out there more often and be willing to answer those hard questions myself as well.
Kristi, final comments?
I just want to build on Dr. Rodriguez's comments sort of around this idea of how we make change. And I hear this politically polarized space. So, moving off that, so, you probably all know Derek Bell's work on interest convergence, right? So you have to use it. When the interests of the marginalized and the interests of the powerful come together, things can really change. I use this all the time. And it's not always it's kind of gross sometimes when I'm talking, because I'm in a business school and there's all this sort of discussion about return on investments, and we're higher ed and we don't really always talk about ROI. In fact, it's kind of, it's gross to a lot of folks that I have to use this language. But what I always talk about is, especially because let's just think about one issue. We are all, as higher ed institutions, facing a shrinking number of students coming to college, right? This is a big issue, but only if we ignore the growing populations of underrepresented students. So the interest of the institution is to stay in business and to stay educating students. That means we have to actually do this work of diversity. So often I find that when it comes to these issues of the political challenges that we face, is that we must find ways to connect with folks in understanding that what we're doing actually benefits them. Now it's kind of, again, it's like the critique that happened during, when we were working with Michigan's case, the fight to maintain affirmative action in our hiring processes, our admissions processes. The whole point was that we had to show that diversity enriched the education for white students. So a lot of people, including myself, really struggle with that idea. But when I'm working with folks that are often I don't understand why this is important, Kristi, I have to showcase the ways in which they benefit. In business, it's very simple. Companies that have diverse leadership and employees make more money, period. That's the outcome that they want. That's how you get there. Better solutions for more people that address their needs come when you have diverse teams. So I have to show them that piece. And when they get there, they're like, oh, well, okay, that benefits me. So I want to make that happen too. But it is sort of that thing of I honestly believe diversity is good because it's good. It's good for humanity. But sometimes we have to help people understand how it supports their goals as well.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say that ever the eternal optimist, I think that the gift of a global pandemic, if there is any silver lining to this global pandemic, has been the exposure of the vast inequities that we have. And it's been the elevation of these equity efforts. It's almost like Andrea and Kristi and even Dr. Rodriguez were talking about, where now is the moment where we have to capitalize on it while we have everybody's attention and push this forward as much as possible. So thank you participants. We had over 100 at one time. We tried to get to all of your questions. Panelists, thank you so much. Personally like to thank Kristi, Andrea, Dr. José Rodríguez, and invite everyone to register for next month's Friday Forum, October 23rd. We'll be talking about establishing anti-racist policy and practice. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon and a very safe evening.